China's military is pathetic with only 350 nuclear warheads. The People's Liberation Army, far from being a threat, is a thoroughly inept and corrupt institution that would fare disastrously in any actual war. Out of 20,000 total PLA aircraft, 80% are estimated to be non-operational at any given time. Their much-hyped new aircraft carrier, Xi'an, was built using copied blueprints stolen from French and American designs, right down to the plumbing. Yet this knockoff vessel's engines break down if sustained speeds exceed 10 knots, rendering it useless for real naval operations. For all the fanfare, China's military is a largely dysfunctional force whose weaknesses vastly outweigh its strengths. Any major conflict would likely end in catastrophic defeat for Beijing. China's aircraft carrier program has major limitations. A symbol of China's naval modernization aspirations is the development of aircraft carriers, which Beijing views as essential for projecting power farther offshore. Since 2012, China has put 3 carriers to sea: the Liaoning, Shandong, and Fujian. However, this carrier fleet suffers from intrinsic limitations, rendering it inferior to American nuclear-powered carriers and constrained in realistic combat utility. The PLA Navy's first carrier, Liaoning, is a refurbished ex-Soviet vessel dating back to the 1980s. China reverse-engineered the Soviet Kuznetsov-class design, equipping it with a ski jump ramp to launch aircraft. Liaoning was not purpose-built for China's needs or optimized for open ocean operations. For instance, it lacks catapults and uses conventional steam turbines requiring frequent refueling. Shandong, commissioned in 2019, is essentially an enlarged clone of the 60,000-ton Kuznetsov class. While 10,000 tons heavier than Liaoning, it did not incorporate any radical improvements. Shandong retains the ski jump deck layout, limiting aircraft payload capacity, number of sorties generated, and overall combat effectiveness. Its range and endurance are still constrained relative to nuclear carriers. China's third and most recent carrier, Fujian, does feature a flat deck with electromagnetic catapults, akin to America's newest Ford class. However, Fujian remains conventionally powered, limiting its ability to project sustained air power abroad. It displaces just 80,000 tons compared to 100,000-ton U.S. carriers. Fujian only began sea trials in 2022 and still requires years of operational testing before attaining combat readiness. Rushing its development may have compromised quality and reliability. By 2025, China hopes to have 4 operational carriers, but the United States already fields an 11-carrier fleet of far more capable nuclear-powered vessels. American carriers have catapults and superior electronics, as well as seasoned commanders and crews whose skills have been honed over decades of real-world missions. They embark cutting-edge F-35 stealth fighters, while China's main carrier plane remains the subpar J-15 Flying Shark. Experts assess that China's carrier program has proceeded with fits and starts, beset by technical problems and learning curve issues. Their limitations include deficient launch and recovery systems, lack of expert carrier aviators, reduced air wing size, limited munitions, weaker air defenses, inferior propulsion, and minimal war-fighting experience. Chinese carriers would be confined to secondary roles like aircraft ferry duty and status projection, as they lack the capabilities needed to undertake decisive blue water missions. Ultimately, for Beijing, carriers represent political status more than military utility. They function largely as glorified training platforms rather than serious war-fighting assets. Despite the hype surrounding new vessels, Chinese naval aviation remains an undeveloped work in progress compared to America's dominant carrier force. As with much of its military pomp, China's world-class carrier program is more facade than reality. People's Liberation Army suffers from critical weaknesses. Beyond naval deficiencies, China's military suffers from critical weaknesses in its overall ability to conduct complex joint operations. Its flashy new ships and missiles disguise deep dysfunctions that would undermine PLA performance in combat. Difficulty mobilizing, technological backwardness, hacker vulnerabilities, and corruption afflict China's war machine. One key liability is the PLA's outdated command structure modeled on Soviet doctrine. Authority flows vertically through layers of bureaucracy characterized by infighting among regional commands. There is no U.S.-style Joint Chiefs framework integrating Army, Navy, Air Force, and rocket forces. Inter-service rivalry impedes coordination of triad operations. Communications and data sharing are siloed rather than seamless. Such a convoluted apparatus could not coordinate large-scale campaigns. China's military is also hobbled by pervasive corruption and patronage networks. Officers obtain promotions via graft and personal connections over merit. Estimates suggest tens of billions have been embezzled, weakening readiness to pad pockets. Resources meant for training and maintenance are diverted into lavish payoffs and privileges for top brass. Missile tests may even be faked to profit from phantom procurement. Morale suffers when the best rewards go to the most rapacious rather than competent. Technologically, China remains generations behind cutting-edge American weapons systems. Certain niche areas like missiles and drones have progressed. However, Chinese engines, electronics, integrative architecture, and manufacturing methods are still primitive. Production quality control problems plague complex platforms, with aircraft engines and ship turbines being particular deficiencies. Although appearing externally sophisticated, Chinese systems rely heavily on reverse-engineered Russian and Western technology that is unreliable or compromised. Ubiquitous global hacking networks notwithstanding, China itself is highly vulnerable to cyber attacks in any conflict scenario. The PLA remains heavily reliant on foreign commercial off-the-shelf hardware and software that can be easily exploited, disrupted, or disabled by sophisticated adversaries. Communications data links would be priority targets for compromise. Both routine military functions and advanced networking would be at severe risk of disruption. Since its last real combat experience was a failed 1979 invasion of Vietnam, the PLA suffers from a total lack of institutional wisdom and officers with wartime experience. By contrast, the U.S. military has continuously honed combat skills through conflicts over past decades. China's forces may look flashy marching in parades, but have neither the technical prowess nor practical know-how to prevail when the shooting starts. Fancy equipment cannot compensate for lack of real operational expertise. Overall, China's military capabilities may appear ominous in propaganda videos and state media headlines, but under the facade of new missiles and stealth fighters is an organization beset by critical deficiencies, rampant corruption, technological backwardness, rigidity, and lack of experience. The PLA's impressive optics serve a propaganda purpose for Beijing, but conceal debilitating realities about its actual combat effectiveness. When called upon, the force may well disappoint and underperform dramatically. Military exercises expose severe limitations of China's Navy. While gaining attention for their sheer scale, recent Chinese military exercises around Taiwan have revealed more weaknesses than strengths about the PLA's abilities to wage war. They betrayed vulnerability stemming from inadequate training, technical flaws, and a risk-averse culture, eschewing bold maneuvers. The restrictive drills seemed orchestrated to avoid accidents and protect China's showpiece assets from harm. In April 2023, the PLA's Eastern Theater Command publicly released a video depicting simulated missile strikes on Taiwan. The computer-generated animation showed missiles launched from multiple platforms, impacting targets around the island. While visually striking, this failed to demonstrate any actual Chinese capabilities. Later that month, the PLA Navy's aircraft carrier Shandong conducted training in the Philippine Sea south of Japan. The deployment was advertised as a maneuver to menace Taiwan. However, the Shandong remained 400 km away from Taiwan, safely out of range of the island's land-based anti-ship missile batteries. It was also constantly shadowed by American and Japanese naval assets, limiting its freedom of movement. During 3 days of drills, the J-15 fighter jets based on Shandong managed only about 26 to 27 sorties per day on average. This is a very low rate compared to American nuclear-powered carriers that can launch up to 240 sorties daily in combat conditions. It indicates a lack of technical proficiency and crew training. Aircraft were armed only for air combat despite strike missions being a carrier aviation's primary purpose. No live missiles were fired. likely for fear of accuracy problems that could damage their own vessels. The Northeast Theater Command's Shandong carrier group transited the deep waters southeast of Taiwan. This was a bizarre decision as that area would be ideal for American submarines to ambush them. It underscores the PLA Navy's inability to operate competently on the high seas. Afterwards, they even had to ask Taiwanese vessels monitoring them to take pictures for their records since the exercise produced little usable footage. This humiliating incident exposes how China's Navy remains an inexperienced force focused on looking formidable rather than developing expertise. Multiple issues plague the deployment. The shortage of land attack munitions reflects China's inability to make reliable cruise missile engines. Carrier aircraft were not trusted to penetrate enemy airspace due to poor electronic warfare capabilities. Firing no live missiles illustrates lingering problems with China's inventory of advanced weapons, many of which are likely substandard or defective. For all its fanfare, the Shandong's capstone training revealed a risk-averse, hollow force whose commanders distrust their own equipment and personnel. It demonstrated an organization trying hard to merely look capable on the surface. China's Navy has undergone a rapid buildup, but quality has not kept pace with quantity. Their destroyers and submarines look sophisticated yet use dated designs. Ships lack modern networked electronics and rely on inferior Chinese sensor, propulsion, and weapons technology. Crew training and professionalism is no match for the U.S. Competence in basic maritime skills like navigation, damage control, or towing are often lacking. Accidents are commonplace, such as collisions, groundings, and even sinking resting at anchor. It will take many years of rigorous training before the PLA Navy can even approach America's standards of excellence. China's nuclear arsenal is surprisingly primitive and small. Amid its general military buildup, China is expanding its nuclear arsenal both quantitatively through more warheads and qualitatively via new missiles and delivery systems. Beijing aims to deter the U.S. from intervention over flashpoints like Taiwan. However, China's nuclear forces remain remarkably backward and small compared to America's. Their capabilities are likely more illusory than real. Most startling is how tiny China's nuclear stockpile is relative to the USA and Russia. The Federation of American Scientists estimates China has just 350 warheads compared to 5,800 in America's arsenal. Moreover, only about 272 are thought ready to deploy rather than in reserve or awaiting dismantlement. This minuscule force indicates Beijing lacks confidence in its delivery reliability. Numbers aside, the technology level is primitive, verging on obsolete. Most of China's warheads are still liquid-fueled, which complicates operations. Solid-fueled rocketry has been standard for decades. There are no ruggedized warheads able to survive missile defense intercepts and detonate regardless. China's only credible ICBM is the 42-year-old DF-5, now thoroughly dated. Their SSBN fleet remains noisy and susceptible to tracking. American anti-submarine warfare could neutralize this deterrent option early in a conflict. China's much-touted hypersonic glide vehicles offer negligible military value. While achieving higher velocity, they do not radically enhance either payload or penetrability and introduce greater complexity. Current US missile defense could intercept these gliders regardless. Overall, it is an expensive distraction rather than meaningful capability upgrade. More fruitful investments would be additional missiles and penetration aids. Beijing's nuclear posture is also undermined by a strict centralized control structure. The Central Military Commission must approve all nuclear weapon use, but key members may be killed or cut off in war before authorization is possible. An excessively rigid release procedure could fatally delay responses. By contrast, America delegates launch authority to military commanders for rapid decision-making. Although China is obviously modernizing and enhancing its nuclear forces, it remains decades behind competitors at best. Numbers are low, technology dated, platforms vulnerable, readiness constrained, procedures bureaucratic. Rather than securing Chinese deterrence, those deficiencies undermine the credibility of China's nuclear arsenal. It is likely orientated towards minimum deterrence rather than advanced war fighting. As with its conventional forces, the facade conceals crippling limitations. In truth, China has devoted enormous resources over the past 2 decades to modernizing its armed forces. It has launched multiple aircraft carriers, thousands of new tanks, impressive stealth fighters, and advanced missiles. State media depicts an increasingly capable military able to secure China's interests along its periphery. Surely, this massive buildup translates into genuine combat power. However, upon closer examination, severe deficiencies become apparent behind the PLA's shiny facade. China's forces remain beset by technical and operational shortcomings that would severely impair wartime performance. Their weapons often use dated designs and technology. Training standards are mediocre and lack realism. Actual experience levels are negligible compared to the United States. Support infrastructure is inadequate. Command dogma is rigid. Rampant corruption saps readiness.